I encourage delegations to engage in a forward-looking dialogue focused on practical solutions and actionable recommendations. Colleagues, we are honored to be joined by an exceptional panel of briefers whose collective experience spans international law, diplomacy, policy, and institutional leadership. And their perspectives will help anchor today's discussion in both principle and practice. And to start with, I would like to invite Mr. David Nanopoulos, Chief of the Treaties Section, the UN Secretariat, Office of Legal Affairs. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, it is a great honor to take the floor today during this ARIA Formula meeting on the theme Upholding the Sanctity of Treaties for the Maintenance of International Peace and Security, organized by the Permanent Mission of Pakistan. I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmad for inviting the UN Office of Legal Affairs to participate. Treaties are indeed essential for the maintenance of international peace and security, as the preamble of the Charter recognizes when affirming the determination of the peoples of the United Nations to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Their sacred character has long been considered a quintessential attribute of treaties. Over the centuries, when treaties have been concluded in all parts of the world, their binding nature had been based on religious oath sworn to express the consent of parties to be bound by the treaty and confer inviolability thereto. Every day in this House, when passing in front of the Security Council chamber, we can see a reproduction of the peace treaty known as the Treaty of Kadesh, adopted around 1259 BC. It concludes with an oath before 1,000 gods, male god and female gods of the lands of Egypt and Hatti. And today, the binding nature of treaties is expressed in international law by the Pacta Sunt Servanda rule. It has been codified in Article 26 of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties in the following terms. Every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it and must be performed by them in good faith. One must stress that the legally binding nature of an agreement under international law is limited to treaties, which are to be distinguished from political agreements or contracts. The conclusion of a treaty implies that parties are bound by the performance of its provisions in good faith. As the International Court of Justice recalled, the principle of good faith obliges the parties to apply it in a reasonable way and in such a manner that its purpose can be realized. Indeed, good faith requires that parties refrain from any acts calculated to prevent the due execution of the treaty or otherwise to frustrate its object. This obligation of good faith irrigates the entire law of treaties. For instance, it is the source of the general obligation of signatories not to defeat the object and purpose of a treaty prior to its entry into force. Good faith is also an essential part of the general method of interpretation of treaties. When a state concludes a treaty, its consent is not limited to the sole provision of the treaty. It is also a commitment for the international agreement to be governed by the regime of the law of treaties. At the outset, it is of fundamental importance to highlight the autonomy provided by the law of treaties to negotiators, which are at liberty to adopt almost any provisions they would agree upon. This autonomy of the parties is also preserved in the application of the treaty. Today, the tempo of treaty relations in multilateral settings is set by meetings of the parties, addressing in particular implementation matters. The general objective of the law of treaties, as you recalled, Mr. Ambassador, is to address issues of treaty interpretation and application in legal terms, so as to guarantee the effectiveness and stability of treaty relations, and not as a matter of political convenience. The International Court of Justice jurisprudence has played a pivotal role in refining customary treaty rules. In its famous decision regarding the Gapchikovo-Nagimaros project, the court confirmed the customary nature of certain provisions of the Vienna Convention, giving prominence to the obligation to act in good faith. The court further emphasized the necessity to follow certain procedural requirements to address implementation issues, which include attempts at peaceful dispute resolution. In particular, these customary principles require parties to seek a solution to any dispute on the implementation of a treaty through the means indicated in Article 33 of the Charter. Those peaceful means are well known and provide a wide range of options, some of which involve a third party. The United Nations, through its various organs, could provide appropriate solutions of a diplomatic or judicial nature, should states decide to use them. I would like to note that the treaty section of the UN Office of Legal Affairs has a limited role in this regard, which is to be understood in reference to its mandates regarding the registration and publication of treaties, and with respect to the fulfillment of the depository functions of the Secretary General. As of today, more than 78,000 treaties and 134,000 treaty actions have been registered with the UN Secretariat under Article 102 of the Charter. The objective of the registration and publication of treaties is to eliminate secret diplomacy and ensure the transparency of the international treaty framework. The obligations of member states to register all treaties they enter into is not a condition for the validity of the treaty. The registration of a treaty depends on whether the submission complies with Article 102 of the Charter and the General Assembly regulations to give effect to this article. Registration of an instrument submitted by a member state, therefore, does not imply a judgment by the Secretariat on the nature of the instrument, the status of a party, or any similar question, and does not confirm the instrument the status of a treaty if it does not already have that status. The Secretary General is also the largest depository of multilateral treaties worldwide, fulfilling this function for more than 640 treaties. As depository, the Secretary General is the custodian of the text of the treaty and the gatekeeper of the participation in the treaty. It is important to understand that all questions regarding the implementation of treaties fall outside the mandates entrusted to the Secretary General when acting as depository. In particular, the functions of the depository do not extend to any of the modes of settlement of disputes under Article 33 of the Charter. Any possible dispute between parties regarding the implementation of a registered treaty or multilateral treaty deposited with the Secretary General has to be settled by the parties themselves. However, the Secretariat may provide assistance in this regard through good offices and mediation, and the International Court of Justice remains at the disposal of states for the judicial settlement of their disputes. In addition, regard must also be given to mechanisms preventing issues of implementation. A number of treaty secretariats or UN entities are providing assistance to parties to facilitate implementation, in particular through technical assistance or capacity building. The importance of these programs is not to be overlooked. As the Secretary General noted in front of the Council a few days ago, the rule of law is foundational to the United Nations and our mission of peace. The Pacta Sunt Servanda rule is indeed the cornerstone of the rule of law at the international level, and its respect is a condition of the maintenance of international peace and security. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nanopoulos, for that briefing. Very useful indeed. Colleagues, our next briefer is Mr. Ahmed Bilal Sufi. He is President of the Research Society of International Law, former Federal Law Minister, and joining us by video conference. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, members and colleagues. Good morning and good evening from this side of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, if one were at the website of UN Treaty Series, one would find thousands of treaties that member states of UN have executed, and they regulate numerous aspects of international relations. These treaties are often portrayed as idealistic, fragile, or secondary to power. In moments of crisis, it is common to hear the argument that states act solely on the basis of national interest and that law treaties merely follow power. Yet this perception overlooks a fundamental reality. International law, international treaties is not designed to eliminate power from international relations, but to discipline it. It provides a framework within which power can be exercised without pushing the international system towards constant instability and conflict. At its core, international treaties are a stabilizing force. They allow states with vastly different capabilities, histories, and political systems to coexist within a shared structure of rules and expectations. Without this framework, international relations would be reduced to permanent uncertainty, where agreements would be temporary, borders would be negotiable at will, and trust between states would be nearly impossible to sustain. International law and treaties transform rivalry into regulated competition and disagreement into structured dialogue. One of the greatest strengths of international treaties lie in their ability to create predictability. States plan their economic policies, security strategies, and diplomatic engagements on the assumption that treaties will be respected and obligations will be honored. This predictability is especially important for developing states and middle powers, which rely on legal certainty to protect their interest in a system otherwise dominated by several powers. In this sense, international law and international treaties function as an equalizer, not by denying differences in power, but by limiting the ways in which power can be used. The United Nations Charter occupies a central place in this legal order. Its principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, non-use of force, and peaceful settlement of disputes are not abstract ideals. They are the very foundation upon which international stability rests. When these principles are respected, states have confidence that their independence and territorial boundaries will not be altered by coercion. When these principles are ignored or selectively applied, the entire system becomes vulnerable because every state begins to question whether the rules will protect them when it matters most. Respect for treaties also has a profound reputational dimension. In the international system, reputation operates as an invisible but powerful form of enforcement. States that consistently comply with international law and treaties are viewed as reliable, predictable, and credible. This reputation directly affects their ability to attract investment, form alliances, negotiate favorable agreements, and mobilize diplomatic support during crisis. Compliance with treaties signals seriousness and responsibility, qualities that other states value when choosing partners. By contrast, when a state disregards international law or international treaties, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate disputes. Violations may not always trigger formal sanctions, but they almost erode trust. Other states become cautious in their dealings. Agreements are negotiated more defensively, and alliances become more transactional and less durable. Over time, this loss of confidence reduces diplomatic influence and narrows strategic options. In a world where cooperation is essential for trade, security, and environmental protection, reputation damage can be more costly than any short-term political gain. The weakening of legal commitments also affects friendships and alliances. Modern alliances are not sustained solely by shared interest or temporary convergence of policies. They depend on mutual confidence that commitments will be honored even when circumstances change. International treaties provide the assurance that obligations are not merely political promises, but legally grounded commitments. When a state demonstrates disregard of legal norms, allies begin to reassess the reliability of that partnership. This reassessment may not lead to immediate rupture, but it often results in hesitation, distancing, and the gradual erosion of strategic trust. The sanctity of international boundaries illustrate why legal norms are indispensable. Respect of borders is one of the most significant achievements of modern treaties and international law. It prevents endless territorial revisions and reduces the likelihood that disputes will escalate into armed conflicts. While boundary disputes do exist, international law channels them into peaceful mechanisms such as negotiation, arbitration, or adjudication. This legal containment of disputes has spared the world from countless conflicts that would otherwise have become permanent sources of instability. When boundary norms are undermined, the consequences are not confined to a single region. The erosion of respect for borders sends a message that territorial integrity is conditional, not guaranteed. This message encourages uncertainty and fear. The importance of international treaties becomes even more evident in the context of transboundary water resources. Rivers and water systems do not recognize political borders, yet they are essential to national survival, economic development, and human security. Water treaties transform a potentially explosive source of conflict into a framework for cooperation. They establish rights, obligations, and mechanisms for dispute resolution that allow states to manage shared resources without resorting to coercion. We have seen treaties in cases of Nile, Danube, and Mekong amongst the states through which these rivers flow as watching for their collective interest. In case of Indus Water Treaty, however, the unfortunate holding in abeyance of treaty led to endangering international peace and security. More worrying is the stubbornness with which treaties proclaimed at the governmental level to have been suspended. The Vienna Convention documents customary international law and treaties, and the said customs shun any action or measure that renders the treaty ineffective, let alone openly declaring it to be held in abeyance. The International Court of Justice in 1997 rejected Hungary's attempt to unilaterally suspend water treaty, and it is a consistent view that they have a higher sanctity in international law framework. Respect for water treaties reflect a recognition that certain interests transcend immediate political disputes. When such agreements are honored, they contribute to regional stability and long-term planning. When they are violated or politicalized, the consequences can be severe. A major threat to international legal order is selective compliance. When states claim the protection of law in some circumstances but disregard it in others, they weaken the credibility of the entire system. Selective compliance encourages reciprocity in violation and gradually normalizes disregard for rules. International law functions effectively not because it is perfectly enforced, but because there is a shared expectation that commitments matter. It is important to recognize that national interest and international law are not opposing forces. In reality, international law gives structure to national interests by promoting long-term stability over short-term advantage. States that integrate legal considerations into their policy-making, decision-making tend to act with greater foresight and restraint. Way forward seems to be to recognize that thousands of treaties signed among states shall continue and be implemented in good faith. The recent forums like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, now have greater role in addition to the organization set up pursuant to the UN Charter. The regional groups like OIC have to up their act now even more and become a more dependable forums for upholding international treaties in their respective regions. the UN bodies like the UN General Assembly, several committees in the UN General Assembly, the Office of the UN Secretary General, and the UN Security Council itself need to continue asserting their respective role under the Charter. In conclusion, international treaties represent collective wisdom accumulated through centuries of conflict and cooperation. They also represent that what has been revealed in various religions has been legislated. They represent civilizational maturity. They may be imperfect, evolving, and sometimes challenged, but they remain the most effective framework available for managing relation among sovereign states. States that respect international law and treaties are actually investing in their own credibility, security, and standing. States that disregard may appear unconstrained for a moment, but they gradually undermine the very foundation upon which lasting power and influence are built. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sufi for sharing his perspective. Now it's my great honor to give the floor to Prince Zayed Rad Al Hussein, President of the International Peace Institute and former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you, Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed, Your Excellency, members of the Security Council, distinguished delegates. I join the other briefers in thanking you and the Permanent Mission of Pakistan for convening this Area Formula meeting on upholding the sanctity of treaties for the maintenance of international peace and security. And I am grateful for the invitation. At the same time, I, like so many others, believe it is almost bizarre we should feel the need to even make the case for their significance and defense. So apparent is their importance, and so obvious is the anarchy that would result from their wholesale weakening. Is it not like asking ourselves to make a case for breathing? Why would we do such a self-destructive thing as undermine them? That is, usurp core treaties relevant to the maintenance of peace. Forgive me for the anachronism. We have been here before. It should not be necessary to remind ourselves, but in 1935, the League of Nations went through a similar series of deliberations, wondering how to counteract the repeated repudiation of international peace covenants and puzzling as to why, instead of enforcing them or enforcing international law, states expended energy into, and I quote, exhaustive efforts to mutually destroy each other, end quote. We all know what course history took in that instance. What is clear to me now is there is no single leader or member state, for that matter, that would want to destroy everything. So why are these treaties being weakened by overt violations thereof, the UN Charter, for example, or their total abandonment, as in the nuclear weapons treaties? What is to be gained by doing so? What does seem rather obvious to me, as to others, is the presence of national leaders, quite a few, unfortunately, so determined to pursue their nation's perceived core strategic interests, they will do so regardless of international treaties or the wider cost. Any more profound global cost for them is simply too distant a factor, a calculation which, if needed, will be made later. You see, they are beginning to scramble now and are too preoccupied by the securing of immediate advantage. And yet, by disregarding customary rules, treaties that each in their own way have contributed to a broad rejection of global war since 1945, they will also be scrambling it for everyone, and will tragically come to realize their colossal folly only when it is too late, when there will be no time for an unscrambling, in other words, no time for peace. They should now take heed of Napoleon's still relevant warning about rash actions along the lines of, it is easy to give impetus to events that then drag you in their wake. Also, some of our leaders aspire to greatness. But what does that actually mean? Greatness cannot be conferred on oneself, either as a person or a country. It is a descriptive term conferred by others, by other leaders and countries on you. And to be great in this day and age, to be reckoned as so, you have to be morally great, not simply militarily superior. Bismarck was even clearer when he said, and I quote, "A really great human is known by 3 signs: generosity in design, humanity in execution, and moderation in success." Unless we change our course heading soon, this being pulled by events which Napoleon once spoke of will begin to make itself felt, and the events will bedevil us, swirl menacingly around and through us, defying easy solutions, ultimately harming us all most severely. The frictions at the crease where the same strategic objectives for 2 or more powers actually meet will only intensify in the absence of legal constraints, making the descent into a global cataclysm all the more precipitous. Only by respecting the UN Charter and international law writ large, especially where peace is concerned, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and by doing so now, can all of this be prevented. It will, of course, require wisdom from all those who lead us. I thank you, Ambassador, and the members of the Council for your attention.
I thank Prince Zayed for his thought-provoking briefing. Now we'll hear from our last briefer, Professor Adil Najam, who is Dean Emeritus and Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Got this right. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for having this conversation. I thank not just you, but everyone in the room for the wisdom in having the conversation. But I say that actually in the exact same sentiment as Prince Zayed Al Hussein's beginning. I was going to say the same thing. He has said it so well, but it is so important that I will repeat it nonetheless. And let me start in the assumption that we are in the room of friends of the international system by telling you that as I was asked to come here to speak about this, I had a class at this time in Boston. So I asked my students that we will rearrange the class, and they asked me, they were fine with it, and they said, why would you want to do that? And I said, I have this important meeting with very important people to go to. And they asked what it was about, and I said it was about pacta sunt servanda. And they were all impressed because that is Latin, and they had no idea what I was saying. So they asked me what that meant, and I said what it means is the principle that if you make a promise, you keep a promise. And that they understood. And then one of my students, sort of with a smirk on her face, said, do you really need a meeting to establish or discuss the principle that if you make a promise, you shall keep the promise? And that is a very thoughtful, children and young people often ask not only the funniest, but the most important and most difficult questions. That if we are here feeling the need, I do feel the need, to ask that question, then that is a reflection on the state of the world, and that is a reflection on the state of the international system of which all of you are custodians. And that, I think, is where I want to start. I will be very briefly want to touch on 3 very simple questions, some of which have already been touched on by my colleagues. The first is, what is pacta sunt servanda? The second is, why is it important to uphold it? And the third is, what can we, well, really you, do about it? And I'll be fairly brief about it and seek then to learn from your discussion on those. What is Pacta sunt servanda beyond this idea that if you make a promise, you keep a promise? But more than that, I do think that we should think about it as something that has three characteristics. A, it is an ancient principle. We talk about the Vienna Convention, we talk about the UN Charter, but it is an ancient principle. It is a natural principle, and it is a fundamental principle of what we now call the system, and whatever the system will be, no matter what happens to it. These points are not simply words. The ancient is important. You gave us some examples. I'm a professor, so I have nothing, I know nothing except to read other people and repeat what they say. Suddenly, I found that between 1915 and 1940, there were a lot of articles written about the subject. So if you go and search when scholars and legal experts are talking about this principle and trying to understand it, that period stands out. And as was mentioned, I think there is a lesson in why it stood out then. One of the seminal pieces is by John Whitten in 1935. I won't bore you with the details, but it has this wonderful set of examples of why it is an ancient principle and why ancientness is important. And I will quote, he has many, many examples. He points out that Confucius wrote that the violation of a treaty would dishonor both man and state. The word used is dishonor. Confucius, this is Confucius. And he says that while Vishwanathan contended that it is in ancient India, the region I come from South Asia, that in ancient South Asia, treaties were respected, and I quote, because the state feared to commit to what would have been considered the most serious infraction of dharma. Now, the reason I mention this is throughout history, you can find this in Egyptians, you can find it in Hittites. Treaties were seen as a sacred principle that reflected not only the sacredness of the document, but the honor and dignity of those who make it. And therefore, the violation of the sanctity of treaties that you are here to talk about today was considered the biggest and gravest of misdemeanors that you could think of. The reason to make that point is not to talk about history. The reason to make that point is that it is a natural principle. Ancients knew it, 5-year-old children knew it. You don't have to tell 5-year-old children that if you have promised them ice cream after dinner, you are supposed to provide them ice cream after dinner. If any of you have children, you have probably lived through this, that without telling them that that's the obligation, they will remind you of that obligation, and that means it's a natural principle. I'll give you another example of why it's a natural principle. In the Treaty of Vienna, they debated many, many things, and we have historians talking about what the disputes were. On this principle, there was none. It was so obvious that to put it. I have belabored the point, but I do think that the idea that it's a natural principle and it's a fundamental principle is important. Why is it important? I'll be shorter on this. It is important because if I am half right in what I have just proposed, then treaties are one of the glues that binds together what we now call the international system. Then the international system as we know it, or have ever known it, and whatever it will become in the long history of the world, is not simply a sum of organizations or states, not only a description of the organizational chart of institutions, it is also the sum of international treaties, those 78,000 or more that have been registered with you and all the ones that may not have been registered. Right? And the reason that is important is if that glue weakens, then a lot of other parts of the international system immediately begin to weaken. I'm not talking about particular treaties here, I'm talking about treaties in general. If the principle of, if you make a promise, you shall keep the promise, is violated in one area, then the precedent that it can be violated in other areas becomes important. Treaties, particularly regional ones and small n ones, but also including large n multilateral ones, are especially important for things that lie transboundary across countries, across the world. Whether they are natural systems, whether they are biological systems, whether they are climate systems, whether they are river systems, treaties have historically had a great successful, you can go through history, amongst the greatest success in international affairs have been treaties that have managed these most difficult of issues. And I think we should be proud of that success, and that success in managing things that actually cross boundaries is a success that is worth keeping. And finally, what can you do about it? I'm hoping to learn from you on that. But one, as again a student of the subject and the evolution of international treaties in the areas that I was talking about, natural resources in particular, river systems and climate systems and so on and so forth, one of the odd things that one finds is that if we look at the system today, we have put more safeguards, we have put more clarity that agreements made between countries are respected, between companies are respected. If you look at the system of how company relations internationally are managed, that has gained more clarity, more safeguards than we have put on how agreements between states are managed. And I think that is also a reflection on where we are in our own evolution. It seems to me, by the way, in the recent discussion and then decision or recommendation by the ICJ on the matter of climate agreements and whether they are actually meant to be implemented, they asked the same question that my student did. That, do you really need an advice on this? That if countries have agreed to something, they should actually do it. But three things, sir, and then I shall shut up, I promise. One is that we can look and we should look at treaties as an early warning system. That sum of 78,000 treaties is a huge board, if you will, with some flashing lights. And we should look at treaties not only when there is a violation, but we should spend some effort at looking at what is happening there and where the challenges might be emerging. So putting some serious thought into putting not simply the roster, but using the roster as an early warning system of where the crack might be, where the weakness might be. The reason to do it would be my second point, which is to think of treaty systems, and especially dispute resolution systems, within treaties. Because within treaties, there is a giant shadow dispute resolution system that already exists. In fact, the many things that do not come to the Security Council or the UN don't come here because they are managed earlier when the system works right. That is why we want the sanctity of treaties and it to work right. And what I mean by that is that given how many things you have to worry about, would it not be nice if these dispute resolution systems within treaty systems can somehow be made effective so that disputes are resolved before dispute turns into conflict and armed options and so on and so forth. Right? If you think about sort of that is like dealing with COVID before COVID happens. In that precautionary principle state, so respecting the dispute resolution systems within that. And the final and last point is for the larger international system, particularly the Security Council, largely the United Nations, to put the treaty, the sanctity of the treaty up again as a way of, uphold it as a way of highlighting and being a positive influence on the bilateral or small n lateral relations so that disputes do not turn into conflicts. Right? So that positive influence effect, the early warning effect, and the use of the dispute resolution system within treaties as a way to avoid conflict before it happens, rather than wait for it to simmer up and come up to you. I thank you for your time, and thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Professor Najm. Colleagues, we are grateful to all our briefers for their valuable contributions and recommendations. They have also asked questions. I think their thoughtful interventions have enriched our understanding of the legal foundation, policy implications, and real-world consequences of treaty compliance. The clarity of their analysis and the diversity of perspectives provide important guidance on how the international community can reinforce trust and respect for international obligations. I would now like to start offering the floor, beginning with council members. If you allow me, I would like to deliver remarks in my national capacity to start with. Colleagues, we live in an era of unprecedented legal interdependence. There would hardly be a state represented here that is not bound, often simultaneously, by a number of bilateral and multilateral treaties governing borders and trade, water and energy, security arrangements, humanitarian cooperation, and dispute settlement. This dense web of agreements is not incidental. It is the architecture for peace and stability in an interconnected world. Treaties are not ceremonial texts. They are the operating system of peaceful international relations. They convert power into obligation, rivalry into restraint, and uncertainty into predictability. When honored, treaties stabilize regions and protect people. When undermined, the damage is not confined to one agreement or one frontier alone, because it undermines trust and cooperation and ultimately international peace and security. International law is unambiguous on this point. Article 2, subparagraph 2 of the UN Charter obliges all members to fulfill their international obligations in good faith. And that is a word that has been repeatedly mentioned here. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties codifies this duty through the principle of pacta sunt servanda. Treaties in force must be performed in good faith. These are not optional norms, they are binding legal obligations and foundation of interstate relations. The ICJ, on its part, has consistently affirmed that good faith is one of the basic principles governing the creation and performance of legal obligations. The court has made clear that unilateral suspension or the holding of treaty obligations outside the framework of the treaty itself and without the consent of the other party is impermissible. And disputes must be addressed through agreed legal mechanisms, not through unilateral acts that alter the balance of rights and obligations. Yet today we are witnessing a worrying pattern. Treaty commitments are increasingly subjected to selective interpretation, delayed implementation, suspension, or unilateral assertions of holding in abeyance. Agreements governing shared natural resources, confidence-building arrangements, and dispute management frameworks are being weakened at a time when they are actually needed the most. The consequences are profound. When treaties weaken, so do the frameworks that prevent disputes from escalating. Legal uncertainty becomes political risk, and political risk becomes security risk. These consequences are not just theoretical. Therefore, when treaties are eroded, legal certainty gives way to strategic ambiguity. Preventive diplomacy is weakened, and regional tensions escalate. And unresolved political disputes, particularly in sensitive regions, are rendered even more volatile. Colleagues, we have had discussions, including earlier this week, for example, on non-respect or selective application of UN Charter and international law. It is in this backdrop that I wish to highlight another concrete but sobering example with direct relevance to peace, stability, and human consequences in our own region, and that is related to Indus Waters Treaty. Concluded in 1960 with the facilitation of the World Bank, the Indus Waters Treaty is widely regarded as one of the most resilient water-sharing agreements in the world. For over 6 decades, it has withstood the test of times. Wars, crises, deep political tensions between India and Pakistan, including the long-standing dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. The IWT's endurance lies in its design, a carefully balanced allocation of rights and obligations, institutionalized cooperation, and well-defined multi-layered dispute settlement mechanisms intended precisely to foster cooperation and to ensure that disagreements, if any, are resolved through law and expertise, not through unilateralism. The unilateral holding in abeyance of the Indus Waters Treaty by India last year in April represents a grave departure from this legal and historical legacy. This illegal act has systemic consequences. It undermines a long-standing confidence-building framework in a volatile region that has since been nuclearized, and it injects uncertainty into the management of a shared life-sustaining resource that is water. Any unilateral disruption to established water-sharing arrangements carries humanitarian, environmental, and peace and security implications, particularly for the 250 million people of Pakistan who are downstream. When the lifelines of millions are placed under unilateral discretion, risks are not just hypothetical, they are real and immediate. The recent arbitral award under the treaty further underscores this point. In August 2025, the Court of Arbitration issued important decisions concerning the interpretation and application of the treaty's provisions. These proceedings reaffirm a fundamental legal reality. The Indus Waters Treaty remains in force, its dispute settlement mechanisms remain binding, and no party has the legal authority to unilaterally suspend or render it inoperative. Let me state that this is not merely a bilateral concern. It is a test case for international system. If a binding treaty governing shared natural resources explicitly designed to prevent disputes can be set aside unilaterally, then no agreement is truly insulated from politics or different kinds of machinations. Borders, demilitarized zones, trade corridors, and humanitarian arrangements all become more fragile. The dilemma confronting the international community is therefore clear. In a world bound together by treaties, compliance cannot be discretionary. A treaty's true test is not when it aligns with political convenience, but when it constrains unilateral impulse. At moments of tension, law must serve as a stabilizer, not become a casualty. We believe that respect for treaties is not a constraint on sovereignty. It is the highest expression of responsible sovereignty. It is how states manage power without force. It is how the difference between escalation and disputes without destabilization. The United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, has a vital role to play, including in prevention and enforcement. Upholding international peace and security requires not only responding to crises after they erupt, but defending the legal frameworks that prevent crises from arising in the first place. Compliance with treaties must therefore be regarded as a strategic imperative for conflict prevention and resolution. So let our message today be clear and collective. Treaties must not become casualties of geopolitics. They must remain anchors of restraint, pathways of cooperation, and safeguards for peace. We remain firmly committed to international law and to the faithful performance of treaty obligations, and particularly to peaceful settlement of disputes, as was exemplified by Resolution 2788, unanimously adopted by the Security Council in July last year. As unequivocally highlighted by the briefers, respect for agreements strengthens the international order. And we all subscribe to this international order and we rely upon it. We must do all we can to uphold international rule of law. I would now like to give floor to council members, and I begin with the delegation of Liberia.
Thank you, Excellency. Distinguished Excellencies, Liberia thanks the Permanent Mission of Pakistan for convening this timely area formula meeting and for highlighting the binding nature of treaties grounded in the foundational principle of Pacta Sunt Servanda. We also like to extend profound congratulations to all of our distinguished briefers for your very insightful briefings grounded in normative principles as well as practical lived experiences from around the world. Liberia approaches this discussion not only as a council member, but also as a post-conflict state that has benefited greatly from upholding the sanctity of agreements. In 2003, Liberia committed to the Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement, facilitated by ECOWAS, the African Union, and the United Nations. This agreement was pivotal in ending Liberia's nearly two-decade period of conflict and transitioning the country from conflict to democratic governance. Although the 2003 Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement was an internationalized intrastate agreement, its relevance highlights that Pacta Sunt Servanda served as a foundational, binding, and moral principle for maintaining stability and ensuring the agreement was upheld by all parties. Today, Liberia's progress from conflict to peace is anchored in this agreement, sustained international partnerships, and nationally led reconciliation efforts. Excellencies, the obligation to perform agreements in good faith is especially significant for treaties, which are among the oldest and most authoritative foundations of international law. Treaties establish obligations between states to regulate relations, prevent disputes, and protect shared interest. When treaty obligations are disregarded for reasons of national convenience, it undercuts trust and credibility in multilateral agreements and threatens our collective security. Treaty guards us away from proclivities of self-help and anarchy to one of collective security and trust in multilateral principles and partnerships. Treaties are not ordinary instruments. They are solemn agreements between nations that reflect our shared aspirations for global peace, security, and cooperation. Treaties form the foundation of the rules-based international order. When we enter into a treaty, we make a promise not only to each other, but also to future generations. We pledge to honor our commitments in good faith and to resolve differences through dialogue rather than discord. Excellencies, in these wars, we witness on a regular basis instances where treaty commitments are weakened through selective interpretations, unilateral actions, or the circumvention of agreed upon dispute resolution mechanisms. Colleagues, Excellencies, when the sanctity of international treaty is undermined, whether on sovereign territoriality, the inviolability of state, transboundary resources management, among others, the consequences are grave. Trust erodes, alliances weaken, and the risks for conflict increases. We cannot function effectively if our international obligations are disregarded, especially to the detriment of the most vulnerable. Excellencies, colleagues, as custodians of international peace and security, the United Nations Security Council has a unique and significant responsibility to uphold and defend the integrity of treaties. This includes honoring the letter and the spirit of agreements by all countries and member states as well. Excellencies, I emphasize that the credibility of this Council and the United Nations depends on our unwavering commitment to the sanctity of treaties. This area formula meeting offers an opportunity to reaffirm, as stated in Article 2, subparagraph 2 of the United Nations Charter and Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, that treaties are sacred covenants that must not be violated for convenience, that by doing so, whether big or small, treaties must be respected by all, for to do so safeguards our collective security and the hope for a more peaceful and just world. Finally, Excellencies, I close with the idea. Do we see ourselves as a people with an inherently fatalistic view of ourselves, that in the view of Hobbes, our lives would just be nasty, brutish, and short? Or do we see ourselves as a people in our collective humanistic tradition that have accumulated and cultivated centuries of reasoning, centuries of ideas and principles that we could apply to find common solutions, not in the light of our individual efforts in an anarchical world, but through our collective effort aimed at obtaining collective security and peace for all of us. I believe that on the latter foot, we are a people with ideas, we are a people with a humanistic tradition, we are a people with a softer side. By respecting treaties and by honoring our treaty obligations, we can forge a better path for ourselves and for posterity. I thank you.
Thank you for underlining the Importance of common solutions and collective efforts, Liberia. I would like to give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to thank Pakistan for convening this meeting and the briefers for their remarks. Treaties are a cornerstone of the international system. By turning aspirations and commitments into legally binding obligations, they provide the certainty that states, institutions, and individuals need to cooperate across borders in the interests of stability, security, and prosperity. We recall the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which codified long-established principles of international law, helping us to conclude, implement, interpret, and terminate treaties. It's important that states act in accordance with their obligations under treaties, including that convention. In this context, I will make 3 points. First, with global conflict levels the highest since World War II, compliance with the UN Charter remains as important now as it has always been. The UK is committed to the UN Charter, its purposes and principles, and we will continue to defend them. Second, beyond the UN Charter, international treaties also support the maintenance of international peace and security. For over 75 years, NATO has kept us safe and prosperous. We continue to work with our allies to ensure we adapt within the bounds of the North Atlantic Treaty to achieve the same for the next 75 years and beyond. Similarly, we have a clear commitment to the international disarmament architecture and will work hard at the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in April to protect and reinforce this. And today, the first preparatory committee meeting for a Crimes Against Humanity Convention concludes at the UN. This is an important step in the development of a legally binding instrument to prevent and punish crimes against humanity. Third, where disputes do arise, states must settle these peacefully. In this regard, the UK has a strong history of supporting the International Court of Justice, and the nomination of Professor Dapo Akande as the UK candidate for election to the ICJ in 2026 is testament to this. International law is at the heart of the UK's approach to the multilateral system, and only by a collective commitment to the international rule of law and the treaties that govern it can we uphold international peace and security and tackle the shared problems that we face. I thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom. I would now like to give the floor to the Russian Federation, to be followed by Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we're grateful to the briefers for their interventions. The Russian Federation has consistently supported the principle of good faith implementation of international treaties. We believe that every instance of a presumed breach of a treaty should be addressed in a depoliticized manner in accordance with the Vienna Convention on the Law of International Treaties and in light of all applicable circumstances. This good faith approach is by definition incompatible with the practice of double standards and unilateral approaches. One of the main threats to the international order, without which it's difficult to imagine international peace and security, are so-called unilateral sanctions, which are currently widely used by Western states. As soon as we hear about the use of unilateral coercive measures, UCMs, which have nothing to do with countermeasures which are permissible under international law, as was initially recognized by the Court of Justice of the European Union, whenever we hear that, we can safely assert that international treaties are being violated. Mr. President, I would like to draw your attention to two situations where breaches of international treaties either had tragic consequences or poses a direct threat, the direct threat of undermining one of the key international legal regimes. Let's take the latter first. I'm referring to the freedom of the high seas. Today, the West is opting for unilateral uses of force, and the West has begun a campaign of illicitly seizing commercial vessels as a way of implementing its illicit coercive measures in violation of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 1958 Convention on the High Seas. We'd like to recall that stopping and inspecting vessels on the high seas, where jurisdiction falls exclusively to the flag state, as well as impeding peaceful or transit passage, these are flagrant violations of the fundamental provisions of the aforementioned conventions, as well as customary international law. Attempts by the by EU countries and the UK to justify in their joint statements, to justify such actions by appealing to the norms of domestic law and supposed violations of so-called Western sanctions. I mean, in practice, these are UCMs, which a priori contradict international law. These actions only serve to prove the fact that they fully disregard one of the key international legal regimes, which in other cases they insist on compliance therewith. Colleagues, such actions could have the following effect: the disastrous erosion of the fundamental norms of international law of the sea, initiating a domino effect and resulting in a defect in the global maritime trade system grinding to a halt. The repercussions would affect everybody, both the Western instigators, but also developing countries, especially those for whom maritime logistics is of utmost importance, not to mention the threat which such actions might pose for international peace and security. Therefore, we'd like to recall that the 1982 Convention contains a wide array of instruments which could be used to hold violators to account. If necessary, these instruments will be put to use. Mr. President, we'd also like to mention the violation of international treaties, which is at the root of the crisis in the Ukraine. Ukraine, after it became independent, was bound by a number of treaties with the Russian Federation. These treaties were supposed to guarantee that the relations were good neighborly relations. What takes pride of place among these treaties is the 1997 Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership, which in essence governed key issues stemming from the fact that pre-1991, Russia and Ukraine were one state. Ukraine trampled all of the key provisions of that treaty across various spheres: security, the economy, protection of linguistic, cultural and religious rights. Thus, Article 6 of the treaty states that there is a duty not to conclude treaties directed against the other party and also to disallow the use of your territory to the detriment of the security of the other party. Despite this, since 2004, Kiev has formalized its relationship with NATO, allowing for the temporary deployment of NATO divisions on its territory. Kiev also enshrined membership in this military bloc, which is hostile to Russia. It's enshrined this as a strategic goal for the Ukrainian state. Another key treaty provision, that is the fact that in Article 3 it recognized the right of peoples to freely control their own destiny. Well, Ukraine used this right itself when it proclaimed itself independent from the USSR. It then has refused to apply it to the peoples of the Crimea and Sevastopol, ignoring the expression of their will, expressions which occurred during the referenda held following the 2014 coup d'etat. It then ignored the expressions of the will of other former Ukrainian regions which took similar decisions. Kiev's actions to forcibly forcible Ukrainization of their societies, including the persecution of the Russian language, Russian culture, and the canonical Orthodox Church, are flagrant violations of Article 12 of the treaty, which ensures the protection of the ethnic, cultural, and religious identity of national minorities on its territory and the creation of the conditions for the fostering of this identity. It has gone so far as Russians and the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass are being eliminated. They were proclaimed as terrorists by Kiev and war was waged on them. It is precisely these violations of an important international treaty, together with violations of the Minsk agreements endorsed by Security Council resolutions, it is they which resulted in the crisis in Ukraine, which Ukrainian elites are continuing to drag out so as to enrich themselves and to remain in power. We'd like to underscore that the international law that's in force contains a sufficient toolkit for adequately responding to growing numbers of violations. In practical terms, this could mean harnessing peaceful settlement of disputes mechanisms more actively, as well as mounting a collective response to illegal UCMs. Our delegation will continue defending the principles of international law in full with due regard for their interconnected nature. I thank you.
Thank the delegation of the Russian Federation and would now like to give the floor to Bahrain, to be followed by Denmark.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Asim, and to the Pakistan delegation on convening this important Security Council area formula meeting, and also my thanks to Prince Zaid and Mr. David Nopoulos, and also Mr. Amir Bilal, and also Professor Adil Najim for their valuable insights. It's very important for us. سيد الرئيس يمثل احترام.
Mr. President, respect for treaties and international instruments is the bedrock of the international system underpinned by the rule of law. This is a vital instrument for strengthening trust between states and for conflict prevention. In light of the challenges we face, we must restore the primacy of treaties. They govern international relations. This requires a collective commitment to promoting the rule of law, a rejection of selectivity, as well as the promotion of pluralism. What it also requires is respect for legal commitments, the object of collective international responsibility, the first line of defense for international peace and security. Thus, my country would like to reiterate that upholding commitments is explicitly rooted in legal terms in paragraph 2 of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which calls on states to honor their commitments in good faith. The same provision reiterates the principle of pacta sunt servanda, enshrined in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is the cornerstone of the international convention system and the foundation for stability and trust in interstate relations. As we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter, my country, the Kingdom of Bahrain, would like to reaffirm that the United Nations Charter, as a constituent treaty of the contemporary international system, is not solely a collective security framework, but it is also a framework for a legal culture underpinned by the principles of good faith, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for mutual commitments. My country is of the view that conflict prevention requires us to effectively use the mechanisms contained in the treaties, including the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. The reason being that this will help to strengthen the principles of good faith, will bolster trust, and will help to prevent conflicts and stop them from turning into crises. Mr. President, in order to bolster trust in treaties, what we need is to act collectively so as to restore the primacy of the law at the international level, to bolster the culture of honoring commitments, to reject selectivity, as well as to foster technical cooperation. Furthermore, we must exchange best practices and ensure that respect for international conventions promotes regional stability, proper management of resources, sustainable development, allowing for the establishment of strong relationships underpinned by mutual respect. By way of conclusion, my country would like to reiterate its commitment to a law-based international regime. We would like to reiterate the role played by conventions and treaties as key components of interstate relations so as to prevent conflicts and maintain international peace and security. I thank you.
Thank the Ambassador of Bahrain for the statement. Would now like to give the floor to Denmark, to be followed by Panama.
Thank you, Chair. And let me also begin by thanking the briefers for their insightful briefings. We commend Pakistan for convening this meeting and for drawing the Council's attention to a topic of foundational importance. Chair, it is a fundamental principle of international law that treaties are binding upon the parties to them and must be performed in good faith. This principle of pacta sunt servanda is arguably the oldest principle of international law. It is firmly established in customary international law and was reaffirmed in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Pacta sunt servanda has a pivotal role in providing legal certainty, stability, and predictability in international relations. As such, the principle is crucial for a rules-based international order, including the establishment and functioning of multilateral institutions. It is also key to peacefully resolving disputes on a basis of mutual trust, reliability, and accountability. Chair, respect for treaty commitments is essential for the maintenance of international peace and security, particularly as they relate to the UN Charter. Regrettably, we continue to witness a disturbing trend of disregard for, as well as outright violations of, the Charter's most fundamental obligations. Denmark therefore firmly insists on the sanctity of treaties, in particular the UN Charter. The binding nature of treaty obligations must be respected, and they must be performed in good faith. And we call on all member states to honor their legal obligations under the Charter and under international law. In this regard, we recall that continued constructive engagement and dialogue plays a key role. We further reiterate the central role of the International Court of Justice in upholding international law and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Chair, in closing, respecting treaty obligations means exercising responsibility, a responsibility which we all share. I thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Panama, to be followed by Greece and France.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. We thank Pakistan for convening this ARIA formula meeting focused on reflecting on a fundamental principle of international law. We're also grateful for the valuable contributions from the briefers. Pacta sunt servanda is an internationally recognized principle that is the cornerstone of the contemporary international order and codified in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on Treaties Law that has enabled multilateral cooperation between member states to be marked by trust and predictability. In line with this principle, our Constitution in Article 4 establishes that the Republic of Panama abides by the norms of international law. In line with this principle, the Panamanian jurist Edgardo Molina Mola, in his work Constitutional Jurisdiction in Panama, a comparative law analysis, underscores that the hierarchy of this order is unequivocal. The pyramid of the Panamanian legal order is the following. We have first of all, the Constitution, then, secondly, we have international treaties or convention, and 3, formal laws. This structure reflects the importance of our country, that our country attaches to the respect of its international obligations and to the fulfillment of freely assumed commitments. In practice, Panama has a long tradition of accession and implementation of bilateral and multilateral treaties, from treaties signed at the birth of our country as an independent republic to the Treaty on the Permanent Neutrality of the Panama Canal. In the global context, treaties have been an essential tool not only for the peaceful settlement of disputes, but also for the establishment of common rules that provide stability and that build trust. The adoption of these wide-ranging international agreements indicate that the value of treaties does not only lie in their legal content, but also in the good faith with which they are negotiated, interpreted, applied, and, above all, respected. We recall the scope of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, as well as the Treaty on Outer Space, the BBNJ Agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the Paris Agreement, inter alia. It is therefore necessary to recall that legal certainty and predictability are essential conditions for avoiding an international system that is governed by force or unilateral power. Pursuant to Article 103 of the UN Charter, that establishes the primacy of obligations stemming from the Charter over other conventional obligations. What's more, the Vienna Convention on Treaty Law in Article 27 provided for safeguards geared towards preventing states from unilaterally legalising the violation of a treaty by way of a contradictory domestic law. There's broad consensus between jurists and international bodies on the fact that there need to be legal safeguards also on an international level to avoid a system that is governed only by military force or brute force. That's why it's necessary to counter the erosion of trust that stems from lack of compliance with treaties, in violation of the duty to implement them in good faith, to prevent the escalation of conflicts, to ensure the protection of civilians, and to strengthen diplomatic mechanisms and provide humanitarian aid. The obligatory nature of treaties is not only a legal imperative, it is also a structural element for stability, cooperation and peace. This Council has a singular responsibility under international law. It has the ability to adopt legally binding decisions for all member states, pursuant to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This is an exceptional mandate and is fundamental for preserving the authority of the multilateral system and for upholding the maintenance of international peace and security that are things that clearly today are under pressure. Exercising it with a sense of seriousness, coherence and determination is a responsibility that we must not shy away from. Thank you very much.
I thank Panama and now give the floor to Greece, followed by France and the US.
Mr. President, Greece wishes to thank the Permanent Mission of Pakistan to the United Nations for the convening of the present area formula meeting, which underlines the crucial role of treaties, an integral part of international law, with regards to maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, which codified pertinent rules regarding treaties concluded among states, highlighted the fundamental rule that agreements must be honored, pacta sunt servanda. Indeed, treaties are governed by international law and are binding upon parties to them by virtue of the pacta sunt servanda rule. Greece, throughout her history, has always observed her obligation emanating from treaties, having as core objective the maintenance of peace and security, the advancement of good neighbourly relations, and the stability and prosperity that can come from mutually beneficial engagements. Treaties, being a primary source of international law, are instrumental for legal certainty, legal security, and predictability in the relations between states. They contribute significantly to the maintenance of international peace and security based on law and justice, on the respect of equal rights between states, and on principle of sovereign equality of states. This is particularly important with regards to treaties establishing frontiers among states, which remain unaffected also in cases of state succession and cannot be suspended or terminated on the basis of a fundamental change of circumstances. At the same time, treaties often reflect customary rules of international law, becoming also binding upon third states, as is the case of 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1982 UNCLOS. The role of International Court of Justice and other international courts in treaties, applications and interpretation should be highlighted. Indeed, ICJ and other international judicial bodies not only clarify treaties provisions, but also guarantee that disputes concerning treaties, like other international disputes, are settled by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law. It seems rather fitting to conclude with the United Nations Charter, a treaty in its own right, with the aim to ensure peace and security, respect for human rights and sustainable development for all. Adopted 80 years ago, the UN Charter has served as a principal framework for the maintenance of international peace and security, the bedrock of international law, and the standard of international actions. It is this Charter that serves as the legal foundation of this very body, the Security Council, bestowed with the primary responsibility to maintain of peace and security. Yet it is this Charter, forged through 2 world wars and lived amidst the threat of nuclear annihilation, that is currently confronted with grave challenges. As we witness the fundamental principles of the Charter being compromised, it is our collective and individual responsibility to uphold and defend them. They remain our shared values and commitments, and they cannot be negotiated. I thank you.
Thank you very much. France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. I thank Pakistan for organising this informal meeting on the essential role of treaties for the maintenance of international peace and security. Treaties play a fundamental role in the history of international nations and are one of the main ways of developing peaceful cooperation between nations, thus contributing to the achievement of the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. The creation of the United Nations, which itself was the result of a treaty, is based on the belief that lasting peace can not be something that comes out of fragile and circumstantial balances between powers. While they are the main but not the only source of international law, treaties can only contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security if several conditions are satisfied, and I'd like to insist on these. The first of these conditions is that the drafting and conclusion of treaties needs to be done within the ways and rules provided for under international law. This involves, among other things, respecting the primacy of the UN Charter, enshrined in Article 103, but also the prohibition of concluding treaties under coercion, which would render them void. It must also be recalled that there is an obligation to register treaties, laid down in Article 102, otherwise unregistered treaties cannot be invoked before a body of the organisation. The second condition is for there to be broad accession to the main multilateral treaties, whose role is to form the bedrock of relations between states. Yet, when it comes specifically to international peace and security, several major instruments are far from benefiting from universal accession. Whether we're talking about certain UN conventions on disarmament or the Convention on the Security of UN personnel and its optional protocol, just to cite a few examples. Now, for France, we consider that treaties on the protection of fundamental rights are part of this category also, because it is established that mass violations of human rights coincide with and often the cause of threats to international peace and security. The third condition is the good faith implementation of treaty obligations that are freely signed up to, called the Pacta sunt servanda rule. However, on this, the situation is concerning. Provisions that used to be considered as sacred are disregarded blatantly and often used, whether it comes to the prohibition of the use or threat of force, international humanitarian law, or the respect to the privileges and immunities of the United Nations. Finally, the fourth condition lies in submitting to legal mechanisms disputes on the application and interpretation of treaties, especially by referring disputes to the International Court of Justice when treaties provide for this possibility. The court exercising its contentious jurisdiction in the interpretation of treaties is based on the consent of states. This consent, that can be expressed in different ways, is a sovereign prerogative. However, once given, it entails obligations. Particularly, this involves for each state the obligation of complying with the rulings of the court in any dispute that they are party to, including when it comes to orders indicating provisional measures. This requires the Security Council envisaging, when the circumstances require it, strengthening the role of the court in the application of treaty norms by making use of the provisions of Articles 36, 94 and 96 of the UN Charter. President, the codification and progressive development of international law is one of the missions of the United Nations. The UN continues to fulfill this mission on all fronts, whether it comes to the agreement on biodiversity on the high seas that recently came into force, or future negotiations on binding instruments on the prevention and repression of crimes against humanity and the protection of persons in the event of disasters. However, this framework of international relations governed by law involves states joining it, and it's in the interest of the majority of states to establish an international legal order that is stable and based on law, while a few states are tempted to free themselves from it. France firmly established itself as part of the former. Thank you.
Je vous remercie. I will now give the floor to the US, followed by Latvia.
The United States thanks Pakistan for convening today's ARIA Formula meeting. Colleagues, when constructed properly, international agreements serve important purposes, such as outlining obligations between sovereign states, preventing disputes, and protecting shared interests. The U.S. national security strategy is clear that U.S. policy is no longer tied to a network of international institutions and agreements, some of which are driven by outright anti-Americanism and many by transnationalism that explicitly seeks to dissolve individual state sovereignty. As Secretary of State Rubio has noted, what started as a pragmatic framework of international organizations and agreements for peace and cooperation has morphed into a sprawling architecture of global governance, often dominated by progressive ideology and detached from national interests. That is why, for example, the United States is taking the required steps to withdraw from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the convention which forms the legal foundation for the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States has also informed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we will no longer participate. The U.S. approach to international agreements and organizations is not one of slash and burn. Rather, it is one of careful recalibration. In closing, the United States is ushering in a new era of peace through strength. Strength can enable the achievement of peace because parties that respect U.S. strength often seek our help and are receptive to our efforts to resolve conflicts and maintain peace. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of the United States. Now I'd like to give the floor to Latvia, to be followed by Colombia and Somalia.
Mr. Chair, I thank Permanent Mission of Pakistan for convening this timely Area Formula meeting on upholding the sanctity of treaties, and I also thank the briefers for their thoughtful contributions to this discussion. In our view, rebuilding trust in international agreements requires more than drafting new texts. It demands unwavering commitment to good faith implementation, coupled with consequences for persistent non-compliance. Pacta sunt servanda, as codified in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, is not an abstract legal concept. As the International Court of Justice has repeatedly affirmed, it is a structural rule of international relations, essential to legal certainty, predictability, and peaceful coexistence. In this context, I would like to make 3 points. First, the obligation to perform treaties in good faith is in itself a binding rule of international law. Pacta sunt servanda requires not only formal compliance with treaty provisions, but also a conduct that preserves the object and the purpose of an agreement. When obligations are implemented in a manner that defeats that object and purpose, compliance becomes an illusion. Against this backdrop, calls for new legal instruments or binding commitments, whether in traditional security domains or emerging technologies, cannot be separated from the question of credible compliance. Treaties cannot function when obligations are treated as tactical tools rather than binding legal commitments. Second, respect for treaties is not just an ideal. It is a proven political choice that delivers peace. The European Union stands as one of the most successful peace projects in modern history, precisely because states that once fought devastating wars chose cooperation over confrontation, binding themselves through treaties, shared rules, and good faith implementation of common obligations. By anchoring relations in law rather than force, former adversaries have built trust, stability, and prosperity over generations. This experience demonstrates that respect for treaties does not weaken sovereignty, it strengthens security and makes peace sustainable. Third, the international system rests on the equality of sovereign states and in compliance with the UN Charter. When treaties are violated repeatedly and without consequence, they cease to be instruments of peace. One recent historic example is a case in point. Under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, Ukraine relinquished its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances, including the obligation by Russia to refrain from the use of force against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. This obligation was breached by Russia in 2014. and resulted in the occupation of Crimea and partial occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. Subsequently, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements established commitments to a full and immediate ceasefire. Presented as goodwill measures for de-escalation, they were repeatedly violated by Russia. In fact, it took over 20 ceasefires before Russia started its full-scale aggression in 2022. We welcome the ongoing peace talks as we seek peace on our continent and an end to the killing, just as Ukrainians do. But Ukraine's request for robust security guarantees and accountability is entirely justified to put an end to a repeated non-compliance of agreements by the aggressor. Dear colleagues, today's discussion, therefore, reinforces a critical reflection. Respect for treaties is neither optional nor selective. It is the foundation of international peace and security. The United Nations, including the Security Council, the Secretary General, General Assembly, and international courts, have a responsibility to uphold this principle consistently, call out violations, and strengthen mechanisms for monitoring, transparency, and accountability. I thank you.
Thank you. And now give the floor to Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, sir. I thank Pakistan for convening this important discussion this morning, and to each and every one of the briefers for their valuable contributions. In Monday's open debate, all member states reaffirmed their commitment to international law and to the UN Charter, and urged other states to fulfil their obligations. Many also expressed their support to recent treaties, such as the BBNJ agreement, and underscored the beginning of the negotiations for a convention on crimes against humanity, and another on the protection of persons in the event of disasters. Colombia has played an active role in all of these processes. However, despite recent perceptions that suggest the opposite, the reality is that the majority of states fulfill the majority of their international obligations almost all of the time. Cooperation frameworks, judicial mechanisms, cultural agreements, and peace and security instruments are applied on a daily basis. Cases of lack of compliance must be understood as exceptions, not as a widespread practice, although they are clearly an undesirable and regrettable course of action. Indeed, and unfortunately, there are very serious violations of international instruments, the genocide in Gaza and the prevention of providing humanitarian aid in Gaza, but also in other places, or obvious violations of the principles of the Charter are all situations where we're seeing the rule of law being watered down, and they need to be called out, and Colombia has done this without hesitation or double standards. At the same time, international courts, in particular the ICJ, have contributed to clarifying obligations in the area of climate change, the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, or violations of the Convention on Genocide through its rulings, and whether they are definitive or incidental, and in their advisory opinions. Although these are not binding per se, they do have legal authority and are interpretations authorized by international law and must guide state behavior. Colombia participated actively in these processes, including by requesting, alongside Chile, an advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court on obligations in the area of the climate emergency. Other examples, concrete examples of positive actions in the area of treaties are the following: the state practice of including clauses for the settlement of disputes that prioritize negotiations and consultations, using legal or arbitration mechanisms only as a subsidiary way, preserving conventional relations and avoiding disputes from escalating, mechanisms on regional integration, such as the regimes of the Andean Community, the Alliance of the Pacific, that help to strengthen the stability, and with permanent standing technical bodies that supervise the application and guarantee the inclusion of all the perspectives. Early warning mechanisms and supervision mechanisms and obligations to present compliance reports also play a preventive role, are crucial, strengthen trust, and accountability and enable us to continuously evaluate treaties. Technical cooperation and technology transfer help states with limited capacities to efficiently fulfill their obligations and develop the obligation to cooperate in line with the principle of good faith. These examples show that compliance with treaties is not only a legal imperative, but rather a whole silent infrastructure of international stability. These tools together strengthen the implementation of treaties since they function as instruments of proactive cooperation, able to anticipate and mitigate violations before they turn into real threats to international peace and security, thus promoting global stability and trust between nations. President, the coherent practice of states in the area of treaties and the reaffirmation of fundamental principles such as pacta sunt servanda are the bedrock of the rule of law. Not complying with obligations or decisions handed down by courts and tribunals must have legal and reputational consequences and must be jointly rejected by the community of states. However, it's also necessary to recall that, in the first instance, trust in treaties is only upheld when states internalize compliance not only as a legal obligation, but mainly as something that's in our common interest when it comes to the value of resolving problems jointly, and that must be prioritized over individual interests, and when we recognize that the respect of treaties is essential for international peace, security, and the stability of the international legal order. Thank you very much.
Thanking Colombia, I would give the floor to Somalia.
Mr. Chair, I thank Pakistan for convening this timely meeting on upholding the sanctity of treaties. I also thank the distinguished previous. The sanctity of treaties is the bedrock upon which peaceful coexistence rests. When agreements are honored, stability follows. When they are disregarded, conflict takes root. For a stable world, the integrity of international commitment is paramount. Mr. Chair, the principle of pacta sunt servanda, that agreements must be kept, reflects a simple truth. International peace depends on mutual trust, and trust depends on faithful performance of obligations freely undertaken. Yet today, we witness a troubling pattern. Treaties are reinterpreted unilaterally. Obligations are held in abeyance. Dispute mechanisms are bypassed. These actions do not strengthen sovereignty, they weaken the international order that protects all states and create a world where might make is right. Mr. Chair, the consequences of treaty violations are immediate. Reconstruction and development depends on predictable commitments. When agreements are undermined, communities, families, and individuals bear the cost. The erosion of treaty obligations fuels regional tensions, disrupts shared resources, and creates humanitarian crisis, leaving civilian populations vulnerable and preventive diplomacy ineffective. Mr. Chair, for Africa, the sanctity of treaties carries particular significance. From the Nile Basin to the transboundary resources, our stability depends on faithful implementation of agreements. Colonial legacy left us with borders drawn by others. Yet, African leaders made a conscious choice to respect these boundaries through treaties to resolve disputes peacefully. The OAU Cairo Declaration, the AU Constitutive Act, and many bilateral agreements are the architecture of peace we have painstakingly constructed. When powerful actors disregard their treaty obligations, they send a dangerous message. That agreements are optional, that commitments can be abandoned when inconvenient. This undermines the entire framework of international law upon which Africa's security depends. We cannot accept a world where treaties bind the weak, but not the strong. Mr. Chair, the Security Council must uphold its charter responsibility to maintain international peace and security, including by ensuring respect for legally binding agreements. We welcome transparency, monitoring, and technical cooperation, but compliance ultimately depends on political will, on the collective determination to uphold the rules we have agreed to. Mr. Chair, the temptation to sideline inconvenient obligations is real. But let's be clear, short-term gains through non-compliance come at enormous cost. The unraveling of the treaty system is happening now, and its consequences will be measured in lives lost and futures destroyed. We call on all member states to reaffirm their commitment to the sanctity of treaties, not as convenience, but as principle. We must resist the normalization of unilateral action and strengthen the institutions designed to resolve disputes peacefully. The rules-based order is not a constant on sovereignty. It is the foundation on which sovereignty rests, the shield protecting the weak from the strong. Mr. Chair, treaties are solemn commitments that transcend governments and generations. When we honor them, we honor the principles binding us together. When we break them, we risk returning to a world governed by power alone. The choice is clear. Uphold the sanctity of treaties and preserve peace, or allow their erosion as a face chaos. There is no middle ground. We stand ready to work with all partners to defend international agreements and ensure that today's obligations remain tomorrow's guarantees of peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would now give the floor to the delegation of China, to be followed by Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Chair, I thank Pakistan for the initiative for calling this area formula meeting. I've listened carefully to the briefings by the briefers. International treaties are an important pillar of the international legal system and the essential legal foundation for peaceful coexistence, friendly exchanges, and dispute resolution between all parties. They are crucial for maintaining stable and predictable international relations. Facing a fluid and turbulent world with rising uncertainties and instabilities, the international community must collectively uphold its commitment to the rule of law, rebuild mutual trust, and strengthen cooperation. Let me make the following 3 points. First, the authority of the UN Charter must be upheld. The Charter serves as the cornerstone of post-war international order, representing the most fundamental multilateral international treaty and the yardstick for judging whether state behaviors are legitimate and just. The principles enshrined in the Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs, constitute the basic norms of modern international relations, which must be upheld and implemented without compromise. The confrontations and injustices happen in today's world not because the UN Charter is outdated, but rather because its purposes and principles have not been effectively implemented. The formulation of any international rules and treaties should not deviate from the Charter, and all international treaties must be implemented in line with the purposes and principles of the Charter. Second, treaties must be implemented in good faith. That treaties must be kept is a fundamental principle of the international law. The 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties explicitly provides that every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it and must be performed by them in good faith. Parties to a treaty must adhere to both the letter and spirit of the treaty to ensure substantive implementation of its provisions. The international community must oppose the expedient, selective application of international rules and must oppose double standards. No country should be a quitter when it comes to honoring obligations under international treaties. No one should enjoy treaty rights without fulfilling treaty obligations, nor should domestic political agendas be placed above international rule of law. Third, disputes must be settled by peaceful means. Differences and frictions inevitably arise among countries during treaty implementation. History has repeatedly shown that sanctions, exerting pressure, or even resorting to the use of force often backfire, only prolonging conflicts and deepening implementation challenges. Relevant parties should respect the principle of state consent and prioritize peaceful means like dialogue, consultation, and negotiation to resolve differences, striving for mutual understanding, compromise, and consensus. Last year, the International Organization for Mediation, or IOMED, was established in Hong Kong, SAR of China, to promote peaceful resolution of international disputes. As the initiator and host country of IOMED, China welcomes more and more countries joining the IOMED at an early date to engage in close cooperation with it and jointly make new contributions to advancing world peace and development. Chair, as a consistent, staunch defender of the international rule of law, China has joined almost all universal intergovernmental organizations and over 600 international conventions and amendments. China always fulfills its treaty obligations in good faith and honors its international commitments. China will continue working with all parties to uphold the international order based on international law and make new contributions to promoting world peace and development. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to the permanent representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo welcomes the holding of this Area Formula meeting. We extend our thanks to the mission of Pakistan for convening it. We also thank the briefers for their instructive interventions. This meeting comes at a pivotal time in our collective existence and for our organization, the bedrock of multilateralism, tasked with guarding international peace and security, which is now witnessing the erosion of our mutual obligations. Thus, Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the UN Charter compels all member states, imposes on them the obligation to implement in good faith the commitments they took upon themselves, including the Charter, which enshrines the primacy of international law and mutual respect between states. In other words, the international legal order recognizes the sanctity of treaties, their primacy over other sources of law, often on noble grounds such as expediency and certain qualities which cannot be ascribed to customary law. The DRC is committed to upholding treaties. We do not believe that this is not an abstract legal requirement. It is the fundamental basis of international stability, interstate relations that are peaceful, and the prevention of conflicts through peaceful means. Thus, laws and practices applied by Congolese judges when applying international law are rooted in tradition, much like many other states of that tradition. In the DRC, international treaties and conventions do not have to be transposed into national law. International law can be directly applied by Congolese judges. International law is applied by national tribunals, and this complements law at the domestic level. There have been several instances where the ICC's statute was applied even before a law on the implementation thereof was adopted. Furthermore, the DRC attaches particular importance to the work of the International Court of Justice as the principal body of the United Nations tasked with ensuring through peaceful means application of the principles of justice, peaceful settlement of disputes, and addressing other situations of an international character which could result in a breach of the peace. Thus, we must assess my country's priceless contribution to the development of international law and what is called today a return to international law. This is a vast contribution which reasserts our commitment to the rule of law, to respect for international law, both as an applicant state and as a respondent state. Now, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for an entire decade, was one of the main applicants to the ICJ. We enriched its agenda, and in fact, 5 cases have already been ruled on and closed. Mr. President, 8 decades after the adoption of the UN Charter in San Francisco, the conclusion is clear. Challenges to upholding conventions remain. War and any other recourse to force should be disallowed in interstate relations in favor of the peaceful settlement of disputes, which prohibits all recourse to force, any violations of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of any state, or in any other manner that is incompatible with the United Nations. International law and interstate relations are therefore dominated by this principle. However, we've seen violence imposed by those who wield the most power. What we're also witnessing is international disorder, anarchy, violence, which is often seen as which is often justified on the grounds of self-defense. And when it comes to self-defense and actions authorized by the Security Council, any recourse to force becomes illegitimate and becomes either a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression in accordance with Article 7 of the Charter. As a result, we see a disquieting erosion of international law characterized by repeated violations of common rules to the detriment of the bonds of trust which bind states and to multilateralism, which is itself confronting a growing number of complex and interdependent challenges, armed conflicts in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Eastern Europe, as well as terrorism, the destabilizing effects of climate change, not to mention rising unilateral practices. Mr. President, true to our commitment to multilateralism and the international legal order, the Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to reiterate its unswerving commitment to respecting the sanctity of treaties underpinned by the cardinal principle Pacta sunt servanda, as per the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, according to which any treaty in force binds the parties and must be implemented by these parties in good faith. Now, this principle is absolutely vital for legal security, for the stability of interstate relations, and for the maintenance of the peace. By way of conclusion, Mr. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo believes that the United Nations must fully shoulder its central role in promoting respect for international treaties. Second, the Security Council must continue placing the maintenance of international peace and security at the heart of its activities, all the while putting the spotlight on initiatives aimed at strengthening the legitimacy and effectiveness of multilateral institutions. Third, it is incumbent on states to also endeavor to act on the basis of Chapter 8 of the Charter, using regional cooperation mechanisms, preventive diplomacy, early warning, as well as concerted conflict prevention approaches. Furthermore, states must be encouraged to promote recourse to international justice mechanisms, in particular the ICJ. Fifth, the international community must bolster robust mechanisms which can be used to confront contemporary challenges with full respect for international law and multilateral commitments. Sixth, states who have not yet done so should be encouraged to sign up to a declaration accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, as per the court's statute. Last but not least, given the globalization of threats, the United Nations remains the framework for considering how to and for mounting a response, a coordinated, comprehensive, and lasting response to the serious crises today and tomorrow. A fairer world order, a more democratic, more sustainable world order requires cooperation between states, respect for human rights, the primacy of the rule of law, and a fair distribution of prosperity. These are indispensable preconditions for lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you, dear Ambassador. With that, we conclude the council members, and we now move on to other members who have requested for the floor. And I must say in the beginning, we have on the list almost around 30 requests for the floor, and I hope that we'll be able to exhaust this list with your kind cooperation. And just another housekeeping note, this room unfortunately is not fully equipped with technology. You don't see the electronic nameplates. So I've been told that to facilitate the conference service colleagues, when I give the floor to the representatives of member states, would you kindly press your mic buttons at that stage, not before that, so that the interpreters are also in the picture. So with this, I would now like to give the floor to the Ambassador of the European Union.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for convening this very important meeting. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia align themselves with this statement. We welcome this timely debate on an issue of utmost importance for the maintenance of peace and security. The European Union treaties, the international law instruments that have served as our own basic constitutional charter, have ushered our continent in an era of peace and prosperity for decades. We know firsthand that respect for and compliance with international law obligations undertaken by way of treaties has profound impact on ensuring peace and creating conditions for solidarity, responsibility, cooperation, and sustainable development. The binding effect of other treaties concluded by the European Union is also enshrined in EU treaties, obliging the EU and EU member states to comply with international treaties concluded by the EU. Most important for this debate, the EU treaties explicitly provide that the European Union shall contribute to, quote, the strict observance and the development of international law, including respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter, unquote. To put another way, in accordance with the EU treaties, the European Union and its member states have a legal obligation to comply with the UN Charter with the aim to, quote, ensure peace and security, respect for human rights, and sustainable development for all, unquote. This includes respect for the powers of UN organs, such as the primary responsibility of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security, that entails, of course, a special responsibility of its permanent members to that effect. It also requires a strong support for the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, as one of the main pillars of the international justice system. We recall that the ICJ's orders and judgments are binding for the parties to a dispute and must be implemented. Chair, the UN Charter, a truly global treaty, has been the bedrock of international law for over 80 years. But we are at a moment of unprecedented challenges and widespread violations of the Charter. In the face of adversity, the EU and its member states have stated that we will continue to uphold the rules and principles of the UN Charter, including those of sovereignty and territorial integrity, political independence and self-determination. These principles cannot be negotiated or compromised. They remain our shared values and commitments. Upholding and defending them is both our joint and our individual responsibility. It is also in our common global interests. For this, we all need to be outspoken and address violations of these principles and the Charter when they occur. It is up to each one of us, and collectively together, to fulfill the Charter's purposes through a commitment and action. Colleagues, in closing, in these critical times, we must succeed in building an equally, quote-unquote, critical mass of unity, trust, and solidarity around the UN Charter and with each other. This won't be easy, but when we succeed in curtailing polarization on things that may have traditionally divided us, the UN Charter, international cooperation, and international law will not be turned into dead letters, and those relying on raw power will have to contend with a very different reality, one where might does not make right, but where right makes might. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the permanent representative of Cuba, to be followed by Sri Lanka.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, we thank Pakistan for convening this meeting. Treaties are the main source of international law and the cornerstone of international relations. They are the most direct and formal mechanism of creating international law and an essential instrument for stability, predictability, and mutual trust between states. Compliance in good faith with treaties, in line with the principle of pacta sunt servanda, is essential for preserving multilateralism and the rule of law internationally. The United Nations system, in particular the UNGA Sixth Committee, have played a fundamental role in the promotion of the universal acceptance of treaties and guaranteeing transparency by registering and publishing them. We support the treaty section and the assistance that they provide to member states, in particular through capacity building, specialised publications and technical assistance. Chairman, the current international situation requires, like never before, the absolute respect of treaties and international instruments. Selective interpretations, the violation of norms, the use or the threat of the use of force, unilateral coercive measures, and the systematic disregard for international organisations and decisions adopted in multilateral frameworks erode the international order with negative consequences for international peace and security and for the economic, political and social stability on many different fronts. In this context, we advocate for the full respect of the UN Charter and for its principles that today are being undermined by hegemonic and supremacist practices that want to take us back, will take us back 80 years if urgent measures are not taken, like a reaffirmed commitment to multilateralism. We most firmly condemn the new escalation on the part of the United States against Cuba under a pretext that is void of arguments, making politics to cause suffering to our people. President Trump seeks to choke the Cuban economy and punishing countries, sanctioning them who export fuel to Cuba. This is a criminal and genocidal act for purely personal reasons. Following the failure of decades of heartless economic war, the United States is exerting pressure on Cuba and calling upon independent states to join the embargo through tariff measures, if preventing them from exporting their own oil to Cuba. There is also a long list of lies that try to present Cuba as a threat, which we are not. Every day there's new evidence that the only threat to peace, stability and security in the region, and the only malign influence, is being exercised by the United States government against nations and peoples of our American continent, trying to subject them to their diktats, to grab their resources, and to deprive them of their independence. The United States also use blackmail and coercion against countries who do not enforce the embargo against Cuba and threaten abusive tariffs in violation of all of the rules of free trade. We call out this brutal act of aggression against Cuba and its people before the whole world. For 65 years, we have been subject to the most cruel economic blockade ever imposed against any nation, and with extreme provisions. These actions are a clear example of the violations of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and of international law that undermine peace and the world order and undermine the universally recognized rules of trade and freedom of navigation. They can also be qualified as an act of genocide. The lack of respect of the United States governments for international law and the imposition of their interest through military power threaten the sovereignty of all states. The application of their dangerous doctrine of peace through strength and unilateral certifications, acts of state terrorism and piracy are a challenge for the whole of the international community. Chairman, we reaffirmed the relevance of Latin America and the Caribbean being proclaimed as a region of peace, and we are soon reaching our 12th anniversary. This huge endeavour places the region in a position for cooperation and peace. However, it is being undermined by the US military intervention against Venezuela on the 3rd of January. We call for the obligations that stem from international humanitarian law and the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide to be fully respected. Lack of compliance with these instruments, as well as inaction in the face of the violations against the Palestinian people, have undermined the credibility of the multilateral system and the international legal order. Cuba reiterates that it is only through strengthening the framework of international instruments, transparently managing them and publishing them and complying with them in good faith. It is only that way that we will be able to move to a more just, democratic, inclusive and sustainable international order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. May I also just politely request colleagues to, if they can, limit their remarks to 2 to 3 minutes, because I want to really go through the list. I have in the speaking order the ambassadors of Sri Lanka, Finland, Liechtenstein, and Cabo Verde. Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, I thank Pakistan for convening this timely area formula meeting on an issue that lies at the foundation of international peace and security, the sanctity of treaties. I also thank the panelists for their insightful presentation. As a small island nation, Sri Lanka relies on the certainty that the international commitments will be honored in good faith. When treaty obligations are respected, law helps maintain order. When they are weakened or disregarded, uncertainty replaces trust and the risk of escalation of conflicts increases. International law is clear that treaties in force are binding upon the parties and must be performed in good faith. This obligation cannot be circumvented through unilateral reinterpretation or the invocation of domestic measures. When treaty provisions are set aside, the consequences extend beyond the immediate parties, eroding confidence in the reliability of international agreements more broadly. In an increasingly volatile international environment, treaties provide a shared point of reference that helps anchor state conduct and manage disputes. Sri Lanka's experience as a maritime nation highlights the stabilizing role of treaty-based frameworks. Agreements governing oceans and shared natural resources provide predictability and establish agreed areas for cooperation. Faithful implementation of these frameworks reduces tensions and supports restraint. Disregard for agreed processes, by contrast, heighten friction and can undermine regional stability. Mr. Chair, there are real consequences when treaty obligations are not upheld. Economic relations are affected and development efforts are constrained. These impacts are often felt most acutely by smaller and developing states, for whom international law remains a principal safeguard of sovereignty and equitable relations. Ultimately, it is the affected populations who bear the cost of non-compliance. Dispute settlement mechanisms established within treaties are essential to preventing disagreements developing into crisis. Resorting to lawful process creates space for dialogue and helps ensure that disputes are addressed without threatening international peace and security. Bypassing such mechanisms represents a departure from the rule of law and increases the risk of instability. Mr. Chair, the United Nations has an important role to play in reinforcing respect for treaty obligations. Clear and consistent messaging against non-performance, together with support for agreed dispute settlement mechanisms, can help deter actions that undermine legal commitments. Guidance provided by the International Court of Justice should continue to influence our approach. Confidence in international agreements is of paramount importance. Once broken, trust is difficult to restore. Built through consistent adherence, respect for treaties is both a legal obligation and a necessity for the maintenance of international peace and security. Sri Lanka stands ready to work with all parties to advance this shared commitment through good faith and respect for international law. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now give the floor to Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. We welcome this very timely debate on a central topic. 80 years ago, the UN Charter laid the foundation for effective multilateralism. It marked our collective resolve to replace war with dialogue and cooperation, to uphold human rights and the worth of every human being, and pursue peace, security, and justice together. The UN Charter, the constitution of international relations, is not merely a treaty. It entails a promise for humanity, a promise to replace the brutal force with the force of law. The Charter principles include that all members shall respect the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of all members, fulfill in good faith their obligations under the Charter, settle their disputes peacefully, and refrain from the threat or use of force. At the heart of the Charter lies the principle pacta sunt servanda, which underpins the entire system of treaty law, bringing legal certainty and predictability for all states in their interaction with each other. When a state enters into a treaty, it is legally bound to honor its treaty obligations in good faith. A multitude of multilateral treaties has been negotiating under the auspices of the UN, and states continue to develop new treaties in response to new challenges. International Court of Justice plays a central role in fulfillment of commitment of the member states to the peaceful settlement of disputes and the rule of law. The Nordic countries reaffirm our firm, unwavering support for the ICJ. The court decisions are binding upon the parties to a dispute. The court's jurisprudence and also provides substantial guidance. Both judgments and advisory opinions constitute authoritative interpretation of international law. Multilateralism and the rule of law are not a luxury, they are a necessity. The global challenges we face today are too complex for any country to tackle alone. We all benefit from the international rule of law, including respect for treaty obligations. The UN remains our only universal platform where all countries, irrespective of their size and might, come together to identify sustainable solutions to global challenges. There is no alternative. We must make the UN we have work better. Mr. President, we have to help the UN to adapt to the challenges of today and enable it to become more effective at delivering on its core mandates on peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. The prosperity of our common future depends on our ability to uphold the Charter and its principles and the sanctity of international treaties. Now is the time to strengthen them, not set them aside. I thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll now give the floor to Liechtenstein, followed by Cabo Verde.
Thank you, Chair. The drafting and adoption of international treaties is a key function of the United Nations and an area in which it has played an enormously successful role. An indispensable element of treaty making and the sanctity of treaties is that they are negotiated and established in accordance with the basic rules of treaty making contained in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The principle pacta sunt servanda, which you have highlighted in your concept note, is one of the oldest rules of customary international law. Its enduring importance lies in the stability, consistency, and predictability it provides to the international legal order. It is as important as ever today as a guarantor of legal certainty and a way to build confidence between parties to treaties. Article 26 of the Vienna Convention has codified the principle, reaffirming that every treaty in force must be performed by states in good faith. The Vienna Convention calls on states not only to fulfill their obligations under international treaties, but also to respect their object and purpose. This ensures consistent application and a common understanding, and thus strengthens confidence between states and the trust in international legal obligations. As a central challenge for us at the UN and for the international legal order, we have to ensure that charter obligations are implemented faithfully by member states. We have been witnessing a steady and dangerous erosion of the faithful application of Article 2.4 on the threat and use of force, which has undermined trust among states and our ability to live together in peace with one another and as good neighbors. In parallel, we are also facing significant challenges related to the faithful interpretation and application of Charter provisions. Article 27.3 of the UN Charter requires parties to dispute to abstain from voting on Council decisions under Chapter 6. There can be no two interpretations. What the ordinary meaning of these terms, according to the Vienna Convention, Article 31, is. We have to work together to ensure the full application of these provisions in accordance with the commitment we have made in the Pact of the Future. Chair, differences of interpretation of treaties may indeed arise even when states act in good faith. The International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, can play a crucial role in the interpretation of treaties. Various treaties, from the Genocide Convention to the Convention on Privileges and Immunities, include dispute settlement clauses which attribute an important and key role to the International Court of Justice in this respect. For this system to be effective, states have to comply with the relevant verdicts of the court, including on provisional measures that it can issue on some of these settlement clauses. I thank you.
Thank you. Cabo Verde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the member states of the Community of Portuguese-speaking countries, CPLP, which welcomes this timely discussion that goes to the heart of the obligation enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations for states to fulfill in good faith their international commitments. At a time when confidence in multilateral cooperation is under increasing pressure, reaffirming the integrity of treaty obligations is both a necessity and an urgent matter. The duty to respect treaties constitutes a fundamental principle of international law. The principle of pacta sunt servanda, codified in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention, establishes that treaties in force are binding on all parties and must be performed in good faith. Article 27 further clarifies that domestic law cannot be invoked as a justification for non-compliance. Together with Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, these provisions affirm that compliance with international commitments is a legal obligation, not a matter of discretion or political expediency. In recent years, the CPAP countries have observed with concern an increasing tendency to dilute obligations through unilateral reinterpretation, selective implementation, delayed compliance, or the suspension of obligations outside the frameworks provided for in the treaties themselves. Such practices weaken legal predictability, erode mutual trust, distort the application of international norms, and risk transforming legal disagreements into political disputes with potential repercussions for international peace and security. Respect for the Charter of the United Nations requires that all its provisions, including those related to self-defense, be interpreted in accordance with its foundational principles and within the limits set by international law. The CPLP underlines that all member states shall strive to use diplomatic and peaceful means to settle their international disputes, to ensure the preservation of international peace and security and justice, as stipulated in Article 2.3 of the UN Charter. Mechanisms to settle disputes based on treaties, including negotiation, mediation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and technical or compliance bodies exist precisely to prevent escalation and preserve peaceful relations among states. The jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice has repeatedly affirmed that good faith governs treaty performance, that obligations cannot be set aside unilaterally outside treaty provisions, and that stability and predictability in treaty relations are essential to the international legal order. We underline the important role of the United Nations system, including the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Secretary General, and international judicial institutions in promoting respect for treaty obligations. Early warning mechanisms, transparency, facilitation, capacity building, and technical cooperation can meaningfully support compliance and support to rebuild trust where it has been weakened. Upholding treaty obligations is not only a legal requirement, but a shared responsibility. At a time when multilateralism faces renewed pressures, respect for international agreements remains the cornerstone of peaceful cooperation and the credibility of the international order. Thank you.
I thank Ambassador Tanya for the statement on behalf of the Portuguese-speaking countries. I now give the floor to Saudi Arabia, which will be followed by Japan.
Mr. Chairman, at the outset, I would like to thank you for convening this important meeting at a time of multiplying challenges on our planet. It is for this reason that it is incumbent upon us to ensure the effectiveness of the missions we are pursuing. Ladies and gentlemen, my country is a founding member of the United Nations. We would like for the United Nations to be able to achieve, to embody its principles. Thanks to our contribution to the organization, we've expressed our support for it. We support international legitimacy as a way of ensuring peaceful settlement of disputes and avoiding recourse to force. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ever since the United Nations was founded, peace missions have been a cornerstone of the maintenance of international peace and security. New challenges are emerging, and therefore, what we need is to assist United Nations peacekeeping missions. These peacekeeping operations are not just peace missions, they're platforms which help to find lasting political solutions by investing in young people, in education, and this to build a better future. Mr. Chairman, the international community as a whole and the Security Council specifically must extend their support to peace missions. We must cooperate with member states, regional organizations, and local actors on the ground, because that will help us to bolster the chances of peace. Thanks to this collective commitment, we'll be able to tackle the challenges of tomorrow and to guarantee that peace missions are more stable and fit for purpose, fit for our changing contemporary world. The peacekeeping approach and the peace-building architecture review is something we would like to applaud. By way of conclusion, I would like to add that in light of developments in the Middle East, we cannot ignore the important role played by United Nations personnel in conflict zones. We've witnessed enormous losses in the ranks of UN personnel. This is one of the difficulties which UN personnel are facing in the line of duty. This is not just a moral responsibility to help them, but it's also a way of us supporting peace, of consolidating peace. The Security Council must uphold its primary responsibility and to pursue policies which will allow UN personnel to work in a safe environment, to not face any threats, and also to counter threats to development. I thank you.
I would really urge colleagues if they could shorten their statements. I would give floor in this order: Japan, Azerbaijan, Mexico, Italy, and Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The topic of today's area formula meeting is particularly relevant to us given the current state of international relations. The role of international law in maintaining international peace and security should be emphasized in today's unstable international environment. The maintenance of international peace and security cannot be achieved unless international law is respected and applied in good faith. Multilateral and bilateral agreements between parties constitute an important pillar of international law, and in some cases their interpretation and application may have impacts on regional and international peace and security. Therefore, the compliance of parties with obligations stipulated in such international agreements is critical in maintaining international peace and security. In this regard, we stress that respecting and adhering to mechanisms for peaceful settlement of dispute is of utmost importance. Looking at past conflicts, disagreements over treaty interpretation can trigger escalation from legal disputes to conflicts involving the use of force. Many states have wisely utilized existing dispute resolution mechanisms, such as judicial bodies, international judicial bodies like ICJ, as well as arbitration, to prevent disagreements over treaty interpretation from endangering the maintenance of international peace and security. The United Nations and its member states should encourage the utilization of such mechanisms to avoid escalations that threaten international peace and security. Japan accepted compulsory jurisdiction under Article 36, Paragraph 2 of ICJ Statute in 1958 and has consistently committed to the peaceful settlement of disputes. We strongly call upon those that have not yet done so to make such declarations. Taking this step clearly testifies their strong commitment to the rule of law. Upholding a free and open international order based on the rule of law is in the common interest of the entire international community. As stipulated in Article 2, Paragraph 3 and Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, it is a duty of each nation to strive to resolve a dispute peacefully. Japan will endeavor to further promote the rule of law. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Azerbaijan.
Mr. Chair, I would like to begin by commending the permanent mission of Pakistan for convening this important meeting. The topic before us, upholding the sanctity of treaties, is not abstract. Rather, it lies at the very heart of international peace and security. The authority of this principle is founded upon a straightforward yet essential premise that commitment made in good faith shall be honored in good faith. The Charter of the United Nations reinforces this obligation and delineates that all members shall fulfill their obligations under the Charter in good faith. Mr. Chair, it's widely recognized by primary objective of the United Nations is to uphold international peace and security. In pursuit of this goal, collective measures are envisioned to prevent and eliminate threat to peace, suppress acts of aggression, and settle international disputes through peaceful means. Nonetheless, despite some successes over the last 80 years, there have also been notable setbacks. Remarkably, in most cases, if not all, violators of international law attempt to justify their claims and actions by misinterpreting generally recognized principles and rules of international law. Azerbaijan's own painful experience serves as a vivid example that the purposes and principles of UN Charter as well as international law must be applied equally, consistently, and without selectivity or double standards. For the purposes of promoting and sustaining peace, greater solidarity is essential with countries that are overcoming the severe consequences of conflicts, including rebuilding devastated cities, addressing the threat posed by landmines and explosive remnants of war, rehabilitating the destroyed environment and biodiversity, and helping forcibly displaced populations return to their homes in safety and dignity. Such solidarity is critical to Azerbaijan and in many states around the globe. At a time when the world is deeply divided and uncompromising, our tribute must therefore be a call to action and a recommitment to the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter and in the sense and meaning in which they were adopted and developed. Azerbaijan reaffirms its resolve to continue consistent efforts towards further consolidating peace, security, and stability in our region and beyond, and promoting and expanding international and regional partnership and cooperation to that effect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mexico thanks Pakistan for convening this important debate, which is taking place in a complex international political environment where the defence of international law and of the UN Charter is essential. In this regard, the Security Council, bearing the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, plays a fundamental role in ensuring compliance with the provisions of the Charter. Chairman, good faith compliance with treaties helps to ensure predictability and maintain trust between states, who are the primary actors in international law. In general, actions that can erode confidence in treaty compliance and thus undermine treaty-established stability often take the form of unilateral interpretations and applications. The clearest example of this relates to the expansive interpretation of Article 51 of the UN Charter, which seeks to extend its scope to justify the use of preventive force, including against non-state actors. In these situations, it is crucial that states do not remain silent and confront interpretations that are incompatible with treaties to which they are party, lest silence be misinterpreted as tacit consent. The International Court of Justice has recognized that, as a principle of international law, that the parties to a dispute, particularly in situations that may endanger international peace and security, must resolve their differences peacefully. In particular, we highlight the relevance of negotiations between states as a first recourse for dispute resolution. Even after a different procedure has been initiated, such as a judicial procedure, negotiations can become parallel procedures capable of leading to agile and satisfactory solutions for both parties. Therefore, the great value of the Court's advisory jurisdiction should be emphasized. This jurisdiction also contributes to the peaceful settlement of disputes and helps to clarify the content of the law, thereby rendering an eminent service to the international community as a whole. Finally, it's not an exaggeration to say that the International Court of Justice is the most effective of the UN's principal organs, given that most of its judgments and orders are complied by on the part of the relevant parties, and the Court itself enables international law to be upheld as the basis for relations between states. In the current international environment, compliance with treaties and respect for the resolutions of the International Court of Justice are essential elements for achieving the purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor now to Italy.
Your Excellency, Mr. Chair, Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Let me commend Pakistan for organizing this area meeting on such an important topic, which we see as a complement to this week's open debate on the rule of law organized by Somalia, which has seen as a broad participation by the UN membership. These initiatives and the interest that they draw among states show that international law and the strong attachment to the principles the UN Charter remain for the great majority of the UN membership key elements of their foreign policy. Italy is no exception, as the same principles are set out in our 1948 Constitution. Mr. Chair, with regard to today's topic, Italy would like to present 4 points. Firstly, treaties are fundamental tools in order to strengthen the rule of law in international relations. They increase stability, predictability, and legal certainty in interstate relations, including by providing the framework for the peaceful settlement of international disputes. It is precisely in this latter respect, and we now turn to our second point, that in 2018, Italy, together with a cross-regional group of states, proposed an agenda item in the 6th Committee of the General Assembly on the strengthening of the international treaty framework. This has led to an important periodical discussion and review on treaty practice in the 6th Committee, which inter alia has culminated in the long-awaited reform of the regulations on the registration and publication of treaties in accordance with Article 102 of the Charter. Thirdly, the elaboration of new treaties addressing pressing concerns of the international community is an important part in the function of progressive development and codification of international law entrusted with the General Assembly under Article 13 of the Charter. In this respect, Italy welcomes the launch of the process leading to new treaty instruments on the protection of persons in the event of disaster and on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, respectively. Fourth and finally, Mr. President, in accordance with the preamble of the Charter, we must strive to create the conditions under which respect for the obligations arising from treaties can be maintained. That also includes reforming the Security Council and making it a more democratic, representative, accountable, transparent, and effective organ. A Security Council capable of building capacities, fostering compliance with treaty obligations, and having the legitimacy to enforce those deriving from the UN Charter when necessary. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor now to the permanent representatives in this order of Cambodia, Thailand, and Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cambodia commends Pakistan for convening this timely meeting at the moment when respect for treaty obligation and the maintenance of international peace and security face growing challenge. With regard to the topic of the meeting today, Cambodia wishes to share the following points. First, treaties provide legal certainty and mutual trust essential to stable international relations and international peace and security. This principle is firmly reflected in the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaty and consistently affirmed by the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice. Second, Cambodia is deeply concerned by practices that seek to bypass binding treaties obligations on the basis of international law or domestic consideration. Such practices undermine legal certainties and the principle of pacta sunt servanda and uti possidetis juris. As clearly set out in Article 26, 27, and 54 of the Vienna Conventions, a state shall not invoke the international law to justify to not invoke its internal law to justify the unilateral termination of or withdrawal from a treaty in force. Third, with regard to the maintenance of international peace and security, Cambodia calls on concerned parties to resolve the dispute peacefully, including through regional arrangement in accordance with the Chapter 6 and 8 of the UN Charter. Cambodia further encouraged recourse to the International Court of Justice and good faith in implementation of its decision pursuant to Article 94(1) of the Charter. Mr. Chair, Cambodia believed the United Nations, including the Secretary Generals, the Security Councils, and the International Court of Justice play a vital role in promoting treaty compliance through early warning, transparencies, confidence buildings, and support peaceful dispute of resolutions, thereby strengthening international peace and security. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thailand.
Mr. President, I would like to join the colleagues in expressing our appreciation to Pakistan for convening this very important meeting. Mr. President, in a meeting dedicated to upholding the sanctity of treaties, it is essential that references to international law be grounded in precision, consistency, and respect for established legal frameworks. Treaties and the UN Charter are not instruments for political implication or selective interpretation. Allegations of violations of international law, international humanitarian law must rest on verified facts and be addressed through the mechanisms agreed upon by states, not through insinuation by a delegation. Thailand reaffirms our full commitment to the UN Charter and to international humanitarian law. At the same time, we reject any approach that applies the law selectively, disregards context, or ignores the responsibility of all parties concerned. Upholding the sanctity of treaties requires universal and good faith compliance, free from double standards. Only by respecting both the letter and the spirit of our legal obligations can international peace and security be genuinely preserved. The sanctity of treaties can only be upheld through sustained commitment, just as domestic laws depend on enforcement. International treaties rely on the good faith and consistency of states in honoring their obligations. Trust and confidence are difficult to build and even harder to restore once eroded. Yet, they remain indispensable for us to collectively do so. The United Nations remains central to the maintenance of international peace and security. Thailand firmly believes that the Secretary General can play an active role in monitoring and promoting compliance with international treaties. In this regard, his good offices should be further strengthened. The challenge before us is ultimately one of political will. The credibility of multilateralism depends on our collective readiness to uphold international law, including the sanctity of treaties in both word and deed. In this spirit, Mr. President, Thailand reaffirms our unwavering commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. We stand ready to work with all member states to uphold multilateralism with the UN at its core. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have Estonia to be followed by Algeria and Egypt.
President, Excellencies, I thank Pakistan for convening this very, very timely meeting. The principle that treaties in force must be performed in a good faith is not a slogan nor a matter of convenience. It is the cornerstone of international law-based multilateral order we have collectively built. The International Court of Justice has repeatedly affirmed that good faith performance is a structural principle of international law, and that domestic law, political expediency, or unilateral reinterpretation cannot justify non-compliance. This principle, the principle of pacta sunt servanda, codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, reflects a simple but powerful truth. Without trust in treaties, there can be no legal certainty, no stability, and no lasting peace. When treaties are honored, power is restrained by law. When they are ignored, selectively interpreted, or unilaterally suspended, the foundations of international peace and security are weakened, leading us all towards more conflicts and violence. Yet today we see worrying trends. First, increasingly treaty obligations are delayed, violated, suspended, or undermined through unilateral acts. Agreed dispute settlement mechanisms are bypassed. Such practices erode trust between states, heighten regional tensions, and increase the risk of conflict. They also encourage others to do the same. If a permanent member of a Security Council attacks its neighbor's sovereignty and territorial integrity, what examples does that set? Secondly, respect for treaties is investment into prevention. When states resolve disagreements through mechanisms they have accepted, consultations, arbitration, courts, they reduce the likelihood of escalation and that could lead to a full-scale conflict or war. Good faith implementation is therefore not only a legal duty, but a practical tool for maintaining peace and security. Third, international community must speak clearly and consistently on this issue. No attempt to rewrite treaties by unilateral action should go unnoticed. We must speak up and condemn when treaties are violated, or we become accomplices to the demise of rules and law. Disagreements must be resolved throughout lawful means, not through pressure and power politics. And to conclude, in reaffirming the sanctity of treaties, we reaffirm our ironclad commitment to an international law-based multilateral order with the principles of the UN Charter at its core. One where law prevails over force, trust over coercion, and good faith over convenience. This commitment is essential not only for today's stability, but for the credibility of international law for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to express my appreciation to Pakistan for convening this area formula meeting on this important matter. I also thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. Algeria strongly believes that the sanctity of treaties lies at the core of the international legal order and remains indispensable for the maintenance of international peace and security. As codified in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the principle of pacta sunt servanda requires that treaties in force be performed in good faith. This obligation is neither aspirational nor discretionary. It is a binding legal duty that underpins legal certainty, mutual trust, and stable interstate relations. When treaties are disregarded, selectively reinterpreted, or unilaterally suspended, The consequences for international peace and security are profound. Such practices erode confidence in agreed frameworks, exacerbate existing disputes, and heighten the risk of disagreement. Furthermore, good faith remains the main basis for both the interpretation and performance of treaties, and that suspension or termination of obligations is permissible only in strict conformity with treaty provisions and the Vienna Convention. Departures from these principles undermine the rule of law and weaken the credibility of international institutions. Additionally, dispute settlement mechanisms embedded in treaties, such as establishing political dialogue on a regular basis and whenever necessary, constitute essential tools for preventing non-adherence. The timely and good faith use of these mechanisms would allow disagreements to be addressed through lawful means. United Nations organs also have an important role to play in promoting respect for treaty obligations through early warning, transparency, and preventive diplomacy. Strengthening monitoring and reaffirming collective commitment to treaty compliance are critical to deterring unilateral modification and restoring confidence in international agreements. Mr. Chair, in conclusion, faithful adherence to treaties is not merely a legal obligation. It is a practical necessity for peace, cooperation, and a rules-based international order. I thank you.
I thank you. Colleagues, I beg your indulgence. Although we have come to the end of our allocated time, but I understand that our interpreters have very kindly agreed to stay for another maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So I would now give the floor to perhaps our last speakers. I have Egypt and Singapore.
Thank you, Chair. So I don't have a statement. I have a question that I'd like to direct at the distinguished representative of the Secretariat. So my question relates to Article 102 of the Charter. And specifically, we're seeing a noticeable trend towards the conclusion and application of non-registered treaties. So my question is twofold. First, do you think it's plausible to argue that the phrase international agreement in Article 102, so Article 102 says every treaty and every international agreement. Traditionally, those terms have been understood to be synonymous. Do you think it's plausible to interpret the phrase international agreement to be similar to the phrase international engagement that appears in Article 18 of the Covenant of the League of Nations? And the purpose would be to encourage states to register instruments that they may not view as legally binding or that would traditionally not be registered with the UN for the purposes of increasing transparency and predictability. And the second question is, to what extent do you feel that the jurisprudence of the ICJ is consistent with Article 102, paragraph 2? There are several examples of cases where the ICJ actually applies, interprets, and employs treaties that were not registered with the UN. I could give several examples, but for the interest of time, I won't. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can quickly take Singapore and then I will revert to David to respond. Singapore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this timely and important meeting. Treaties are an indispensable tool in international relations. Singapore believes that a strong and robust international treaty framework is a critical component of a multilateral system grounded in international law, which is particularly essential for small states such as Singapore to survive and thrive. Allow me to offer 3 observations. First, the General Assembly, Security Council, and the International Court of Justice play critical roles in the development of international law and in ensuring its implementation. Singapore has contributed to major treaty-making processes, such as the 3rd UN Conference on the Law of the Sea and the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, BBNJ, Intergovernmental Conference. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which enjoys near universal adherence and is today considered the constitution of the oceans, is an excellent example of how a multilateral treaty can contribute to greater stability, shared prosperity, and peaceful relations between states. We hope that the recent entry into force of the BBNJ agreement on 17 January will also contribute to the collective use and governance of our maritime global commons. Second, Singapore was a co-proponent of the General Assembly's agenda item on strengthening and promoting the international treaty framework in 2018, and we co-facilitate the resolution under this biennial item with Brazil. The resolutions under this item, which are adopted by consensus, have underlined tangible progress in strengthening the international treaty framework. For example, there have been updates to the rules for the registration and publication of treaties in accordance with Article 102 of the Charter, and thematic debates on treaty practice facilitated by a UN Secretary-General report based on information provided by states. Voluntary contributions invited by the resolutions have also enabled the restarting of regional workshops on treaty law and practice organized by the UN Treaty Section, with such workshops having been held in El Salvador, Ethiopia, and Singapore. Third, Singapore reaffirms its long-standing support for the peaceful settlement of disputes, as enshrined in Article 2.3 of the UN Charter. It is important that parties to an agreement avail themselves of the relevant dispute settlement mechanisms provided for in that agreement. Singapore has sought to improve accessibility to complementary mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes. Intergovernmental organizations such as the Permanent Court of Arbitration and the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes have presence in Singapore. We have also provided a neutral venue for interstate dispute resolution, for example, in hosting conciliation meetings under UNCLOS involving Australia and Timor-Leste. In line with our support for the ICJ and its role in upholding international law and dispute settlement, we have nominated Ambassador Rina Lee for election to the ICJ for the term 2027 to 2036. We stand ready to work with all states to reinforce respect for treaty obligations and provisions and international law, which fundamentally contribute to a more predictable and peaceful global order. I thank you.
Thank you. David, a challenge. Could you respond to those questions in 2 minutes?
I'll do it
Or
in
less.
1 minute.
Yes.
Thank you very much. 3 points. Thank you very much for the question. The obligation to register treaties actually predate the United Nations, was in the Covenant of the League, and it has one single objective. Secret diplomacy, secret treaties was considered one of the reasons that triggered the First World War and the continuation of the war. So you may see it as something very procedural. It is linked to the topic that we're on right now. The question how to encourage states to register treaties has nothing to do with the drafting of the Charter. We know what it is. It's a lack of awareness for many states. The answer is very simple. It's what the distinguished delegates from Singapore just mentioned, as well as the distinguished delegates from Cuba. This is capacity building. We are doing that thanks to the help of member states. We have done that in many states, and we will do for the first time in April a capacity building workshop for the Pacific. Number 3, the jurisprudence of the ICJ in 10 seconds. It's very simple. There's an obligation to register treaties under Article 102 of the Charter. If you don't do so and end up in a case in front of the court, you will give the opportunity for the other state to say this is not a treaty. And this is exactly what's happening. And what we see over and over is that if you conclude a treaty and you want to be on safe ground for possible dispute resolution, well, register treaties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I ask Prince Zayed, Professor Adil Najam, if you would like to come in for a minute each? No?
No, just to thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I mean, not by way of trying to summarize the discussion, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished briefers and all participating member states for what I can say it was a rich and substantive discussion. The interest in the subject was very evident with the large participation that was in the room, but regrettably, not all delegations were able to speak. But some keywords, I think they need to be repeated, they were reverberating throughout the discussions: pacta sunt servanda, good faith, and the assertion by almost all speakers that treaties, they help preserve trust and stability and an element of predictability in international relations, and they must not be subjected to unilateral interpretations or violations or to double standards and selectivity in implementation, because that's very important. So I understand the level of commitment that was demonstrated by this discussion. It's very clear. We have clearly stated that there is an obligation to uphold the treaties, and this is a collective responsibility. And the United Nations, through the Security Council, as well as the ICJ, remain central guardians of the sanctity of the treaties. And cooperation and dialogue remain paramount. The discussion also served to reaffirm our commitment to international law, UN Charter, and good faith compliance with treaties, and last of all, very importantly, peaceful settlement of disputes. We will prepare a summary of the meeting under our own responsibility, which we will share with member states. I thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you. That was very well done. Very well managed as well. Professor, thank you so much.